Welcome to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. Well, hello everyone. It's good to see you again, friends. So sorry for not being around for Thoughts on News. That is a different, what I'm up to today. I'm going to be continuing reading today, and I'll be continuing with Tuesday reads today. Thoughts on News will be sporadic. Kind of had a really bad couple of weeks. One with domestic goddess issues, but we have a family update that we lost our youngest cat, and it didn't go well. The one that I've talked about several times, the one that drank from a squirt bottle and everything. Yeah, we lost her. It's been very, very hard. She was my husband's emotional support animal, so please keep my husband in your prayers. But I'm going to continue today with Tuesday reads, and we start off with Eothen. Okay, we'll be continuing on in Chapter 5. Infidel Smyrna. Smyrna, or Dior Izmir, Infidel Smyrna, as the Muslims call it, is the main point of commercial contact betwixt Europe and Asia. You are there surrounded by the people and the confused customs of many and various nations. You see the fussy European adopting the East and claiming his restlessness with the long Turkish pipe of tranquility. You see Jews offering services and receiving blows. On one side, you have a fellow whose dress and white beard would give you a good idea of the true Oriental, if it were not for the gob mouche expression of countenance, which he is swallowing an article in a French newspaper, and there, just by, is a genuine Osmanli, smoking away with all the majesty of a sultan. But before you have time to admire sufficiently his tranquil dignity and his soft Asiatic repose, the poor old fellow is ruthlessly run down by an English midshipman, who has set sail on a Smyrna hack, such as the incongruities of the infidel city at ordinary times. But when I was there, our friend Carrigaholt had imported himself and his oddities as an accession to the other and inferior wonders of Smyrna. I was sitting alone in my room one day at Constantinople when I heard Methley approaching my door with shouts of laughter and welcome, and presently I recognized that particular cry by which our friend Carrigaholt expresses his emotions. He soon explained to us the final causes by which the fates have worked out their wonderful purpose of bringing him to Constantinople. Footnote: The Jews of Smyrna are poor, and having little merchandise of their own to dispose of, they are sadly importunate in offering their services as intermediaries. Their troublesome conduct has led to the custom of beating them in the open streets. It is useful for the Europeans to carry long sticks with them for the express purpose of keeping off the chosen people. I always felt ashamed to strike the poor fellows myself, but I confess to the amusement with which I witnessed the observance of this custom by other people. The Jew seldom got hurt much, for he was always expecting the blow, and was ready to recede from it the moment it came. One could not help being rather gratified at seeing him bound away so nimbly, with his long robes floating out in the air, and then again wheel around and return with fresh importunities. He was always, very fond of sailing, but he had got into such sad scrapes, including, I think, a lawsuit on account of his last yacht, and he took into his head to have a cruise in a merchant vessel. So he went to Liverpool and looked through the craft lying ready to sail, till he found a smart schooner that perfectly suited his taste. The destination of the vessel was the last thing he thought of, and when he was told that she was bound for Constantinople, he merely assented to that as a part of the arrangement, to which he had no objection. As soon as the vessel had sailed, the hapless passenger discovered that his skipper carried on board an enormous wife with an inquiring mind, and an irresistible tendency to impart her opinions. She looked upon her guest as upon a piece of waste intellect that ought to be carefully tilled. She tilled him accordingly. If the dons at Oxford could have seen poor Carrigaholt thus absolutely attending lectures in the Bay of Biscay, they would surely have thought him sufficiently punished for all the wrongs he did them, whilst he was preparing himself under their care for other and more boisterous university. The voyage did not last more than 6 or 8 weeks, and the philosophy inflicted upon Carrigaholt was not entirely fatal to him. Certainly he was somewhat emaciated, and, for aught I know, he may have subscribed too largely to the Femme Right of Reason Society. But it did not appear that his health had been seriously affected. There was a scheme on foot, it would seem, for taking the passenger back to England in the same schooner, a scheme, in fact, for keeping him perpetually afloat and perpetually saturated with arguments. But when Carrigaholt found himself ashore, and remembered that the skipperina, who had impudently remained on board, was not there to enforce her suggestions, he was open to the hints of his servant, a very sharp fellow, who arranged a plan for escaping, and finally brought off his master to Giuseppini's hotel. Our friend afterwards went by sea to Smyrna, and there he now was in his glory, and had a good, or at all events, a gentlemanlike judgment in matters of taste. And his great object was to surround himself with all that his fancy could dictate. He lived in a state of perpetual negotiation. He was forever on the point of purchasing, not only the material productions of the place, but all sorts of such fine ware as intelligence, fidelity, and so on. He was most curious, however, as the purchaser of the affection. Sometimes he would imagine that he had a marital aptitude, and his fancy would sketch a graceful picture in which he appeared reclining on a divan, with a beautiful Greek woman fondly crouched at his feet, and soothing him with the witchery of her guitar. Having satisfied himself with the ideal picture thus created, he would pass into action the guitar, and he would buy instantly, and would give such intimations of his wish to be wedded to a Greek as could not fail to produce great excitement in the families of the beautiful Smyrnites. Then again, and just in time, perhaps, to save him from the yoke, his dream would pass away, and another would come in its stead, and he would suddenly feel the yearnings of a father's love, and willing by force of gold to transcend all natural preliminaries, he would issue instructions for the purchase of some dutiful child that could be warranted to love him as a parent. Then, at another time, he would be convinced that the attachment of menials might satisfy the longings of his affectionate heart, and thereupon he would give orders to his slave merchant for something in the way of eternal fidelity. You may well imagine that this anxiety of Carrigaholt to purchase not only the scenery, but the many dramatis personae belonging to his dreams, with all their goodness and graces complete, necessarily gave an immense stimulus to the trade and the intrigue of Smyrna, and created a demand for human virtues, which the moral resources of the place were totally inadequate to supply. Every day, after breakfast, his lover of the good and beautiful held a levee. In his anteroom there would not only the sellers of pipes and slippers and shawls and such like oriental merchandise, not only embroiderers and cunning workmen patiently striving to realize his visions of Albanian dresses, not only the servants offering for places and the slave dealer tending his stable ware, but there would be the Greek master waiting to teach his pupil the grammar of the soft Ionian tongue in which he was to delight the wife of his imagination, and the music master who was to teach him some sweet replies to the anticipated tones of the fancy guitar. And then, above all, and proudly eminent with undisputed preference of the entree, and fraught with the mysterious tidings on which the realization of the whole dream might depend, was the mysterious matchmaker. Enticing, footnote, hold on. Marriages in the East are arranged by professed matchmakers. Many of these, I believe, are Jewesses. Where was I? Uh-oh. Enticing and postponing the suitor, yet ever keeping alive his soul, the love of that pictured virtue, whose beauty, unseen by eyes, was half revealed to the imagination. You would have thought that this practical dreaming must have soon brought Carrigaholt to a bad end, but he was in much less danger than might be supposed, for besides that the new visions of happiness almost always came in time to contact the fatal completion of the preceding scheme. His high breeding and his delicacy, sensitive taste almost always befriended him at times when he was left without any other protection, and the efficacy of these qualities in keeping a man out of harm's way is really immense. In all baseness and imposture, there is a coarse, vulgar spirit, which, however artfully concealed for a time, must sooner or later show itself in some little circumstance sufficiently plain to occasion an instant jar upon the minds of those whose taste is lively and true. To such men, a shock of this kind, disclosing the ugliness of a cheat, is more effectively convincing than any mere proofs could be. Thus guarded from isle to isle, and through Greece and through Albania, this practical Plato, with a purse in his hand, carried on his mad chase after the good and the beautiful, and yet returned in safety to his home. But now, poor fellow, the lowly grave that is the end of men's romantic hopes has caused over all his rich fancies and all his high aspirations. He is utterly married. No more hope. No more change for him. No more relays. He must go. He must go on venturini-wise to the appointed end of his journey. Smyrna, I think, may be called the chief town and capital of that Grecian race against which you will be cautioned so carefully as soon as you touch the Levant. You will say that I ought not to confound as one people the Greeks living under a constitutional government with the unfortunate Rayas who groan under the Turkish yoke. But I can't see that political events have hitherto produced any strongly marked difference of character. If I could venture to rely, this I feel that I cannot at all do, upon my own observation, I should tell you that there were more hardiness and strength in the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire than in those of the new kingdom. The truth is that there is a greater field for commercial enterprise, and even for Greek ambition under the Ottoman scepter, than is to be found in the dominions of Otho. Indeed, the people, by their frequent migrations from the limits of the constitutional kingdom to the territories of the Porte, seem to show that on the whole they prefer groaning under the Turkish yoke to the honor of being the only true source of legitimate power in their own land. For myself, I love the race, in spite of their vices, and even in spite of all of their meanness. I remember the blood that is in them, and still love the Greeks. The Osmanlis are, of course, by nature, by religion, and by politics, the strong foes of the Hellenic people, and as the Greeks, poor fellows, happen to be a little deficient in some of the virtues which facilitate the transaction of commercial business, such as veracity, fidelity, etc., it naturally follows that they are highly unpopular with the European merchants. Now these are the persons through whom, either directly or indirectly, is derived the greater part of the information which you gather in the Levant. And therefore, you must make up your mind to hear an almost universal and unbroken testimony against the character of the people whose ancestors invented virtue. And strange to say, the Greeks themselves do not attempt to disturb this general uni, unanim, unanimity, unanimity, unanimity. That's a weird word. Of opinion by any dissent on their part, question a Greek on the subject, and he will tell you at once that the people are traditory, and will then perhaps endeavor to shake off his fair share of the imputation by asserting that his father had been dragoman to some foreign embassy, and that he, the son, therefore, by the law of nations, had ceased to be Greek. Et dunque no c'était traditori. Possible, signor, ma almeno io no sono greco. Not even the diplomatic representatives of the Hellenic kingdom are free from the habit of depreciating their brethren. I recollect that at one of the ports in Syria, a Greek vessel was rather unfairly kept in quarantine by order of the Board of Health, a board which consisted entirely of Europeans. A consular agent from the kingdom of Greece had lately hoisted his flag in the town, and the captain of the vessel drew up a remonstrance and requested his consul to lay it before the board. Now, is this reasonable? Said the consul. Is it reasonable that I should place myself in collision with all the principal European gentlemen of the place for the sake of you Greek? Of you, a Greek? The skipper was greatly vexed at the failure of his application, but he scarcely even questioned the justice of the ground which his consul had taken. Well, it happened some time afterwards that I found myself at the same port, having gone thither with the view of embarking for the port of Syra. I was anxious, of course, to elude as carefully as possible the quarantine detentions which threatened me on my arrival, and hearing that the Greek consul had a brother who was a man in authority at Syra, I got myself presented to the former, and took the liberty of asking him to give me such a letter of introduction to his relative in Syra as might possibly have the effect of shortening the term of quarantine. He acceded to this request with the utmost kindness and courtesy, but when he replied to my thanks by saying that in serving an Englishman he was doing no more than his strict duty commanded, not even my gratitude could prevent me from calling to mind his treatment of the poor captain who had the misfortune of not being an alien in blood to his consul and appointed protector. I think that the change which has taken place in the character of the Greeks has been occasioned in great measure by the doctrines and practice of their religion. The Greek Church has animated the Muscovite peasant and inspired him with hopes and ideas which, however humble, are still better than none at all. But the faith and the forms and the strange ecclesiastical literature which acts so advantageously upon the mere clay of the Russian serf seem to hang like lead upon the ethereal spirit of the Greek. Never in any part of the world have I seen religious performances so painful to witness as those of the Greeks. The horror, however, with which one shudders at their worship is attributable in some measure to the mere effect of costume. In all the Ottoman dominions, and very frequently too In the kingdom of Otho, the Greeks wear turbans or other headdresses and shave their heads, leaving only a rat's tail at the crown of the head. They, of course, keep themselves covered within doors as well as abroad, and they never remove their headgear merely on account of being in a church. But when the Greek stops to worship at his proper shrine, then and only then he always uncovers, and as you see him thus with shaven skull and savage tail depending from his crown, kissing a thing of wood and glass, and cringing with base prostrations and apparent terror before a miserable picture, you see superstition in a shape which, outwardly at least, is sadly abject and repulsive. The fasts, too, of the Greek church produce an ill effect upon the character of the people, for they are not a mere farce, but are carried to such an extent as to bring about a real mortification of the flesh, the febrile irritation of the frame, operating in conjunction with the depression of the spirits, occasioned by abstinence, will so far answer the objects of the rite as to engender some religious excitement. But this is of a morbid and gloomy character, and it seems to be certain that along with the increases of sanctity, there comes a fiercer desire for the perpetuation of dark crimes. The number of murders committed during Lent is greater, I am told, than any other time of year. A man under the influence of a bean dietary, for this is the principal food of the Greeks during their fasts, will be in an apt humor for enriching the shrine of his saint, and passing a knife through his next door neighbor. The monies deposited upon the shrines are appropriated by priests. The priests are married men and have families to provide for. They take the good with the bad and continue to recommend fasts. Then, too, the Greek church enjoins her followers to keep holy such a vast number of saints' days as practically to 1/3 out of the number of days in the year that are kept holy, or rather kept stupid, in honor of the saints. No great portion of the time thus set apart is spent in religious exercises, and the people don't betake themselves to any such animating pastimes as might serve to strengthen the frame, or invigorate the mind, or exalt the taste. On the contrary, the saints' days of the Greeks in Smyrna are passed in the same manner as the Sabbaths of well-behaved Protestant housemaids in London. That is to say, in a steady and serious contemplation of street scenery, the men perform this duty at the doors of their houses, the women at the windows. Windows, indeed, by the custom of Greek towns, are so decidedly appropriated to the gentle sex that a man would be looked upon as utterly effeminate if he ventured to choose such a position for the keeping of his saints' days. I was present one day at a treaty for the hire of some apartments at Smyrna, which was carried on between Carrigaholt and the Greek woman to whom the rooms belonged. Carrigaholt objected that the windows commanded no view of the street. Immediately the brow of the majestic matron was clouded, and with all the scorn of a Spartan mother she coolly asked Carrigaholt and said, Art thou a tender damsel that thou wouldst sit and gaze from windows? The man whom she addressed, however, had not gone to Greece with any intention of placing himself under the laws of Lycurgus, and was not to be diverted from his views by a Spartan rebuke. So he took care to find himself windows after his own heart, and there, I believe, for many a month he kept the saints' days, and all the days intervening after the fashion of Grecian women. Oh, let me be charitable to all who write, and to all who lecture, and to all who preach, since even I, a layman, not forced to write at all, can hardly avoid chiming in with some tuneful cant. I have had the heart to talk about the pernicious effects of the Greek holidays, and yet to these I owe most gracious and beautiful visions. I will let words stand as a humbling proof that I am subject to that nearly immutable law which compels a man with a pen in his hand to be uttering every now and then some sentiment not his own. It seems as though the power of expressing regrets and desires by written symbols were coupled with a condition that the writer should from time to time express the regrets and desires of other people, as though, like a French peasant under the old regime, he were bound to perform a certain amount of work upon the public highways. I rebel as stoutly as I can against this horrible querelle. I try not to deceive you. I try to set down the thoughts which are fresh within me, and not to pretend any wishes or griefs which I do not really feel. But no sooner do I cease from watchfulness in this regard than my right hand is, as it were, seized by some false angel. And even now, you see, I have been forced to put down such words and sentences as I ought to have written, if really and truly I wish to disturb the saints' days of the beautiful Smyrnaites. Disturb their saints' days? Oh no. For as you move through the narrow streets of the city at these times of festival, the transom-shaped windows suspended over your head on either side are filled with the beautiful descendants of the old Ionian race. All, even yonder, impressed, throned at the window of that humblest mud cottage, are attired with seeming magnificence. Their classic heads are crowned with scarlet and laden with jewels or coins of gold, the whole wealth of the wearers. Footnote: a Greek woman wears her whole fortune upon her person, in the shape of jewels or gold coins, and I believe that this mode of investment is adopted in great measure for safety's sake. It has the advantage of enabling a suitor to reckon as well as to admire the objects of his affection. Okay, let's see, go back. Okay. Jewels or coins of gold, the whole wealth of the wearers. Their features are touched with a savage pencil, hardening the outline of eyes and eyebrows, and lending an unnatural fire to the stern, grave looks which they pierce your brain. Endure their fiery looks as best you may, and ride on slowly and reverently, for facing you from the side of the transom that looks longwise through the street, you see one glorious shape transcendent in its beauty. You see the massive braid of hair as it catches a touch of light on its jetty surface, and the broad, calm, angry brow the large eyes deeply set and self-relying as the eyes of a conqueror. With all their rich shadows of thought lying darkly around them, you see the thin, fiery nostril and the bold line of the chin and throat disclosing all the fierceness and all the pride, passion, and power that can live along with the rare womanly beauty of those sweetly turned lips. But then there is a terrible stillness in this breathing image. It seems like the stillness of a savage that sits intent and brooding day by day upon some one fearful scheme of vengeance, and yet more like it seems to the stillness of an immortal whose will must be known and obeyed without sign or speech. Bow down, and adore the young Persephone, transcendent queen of shades. All right, and that is the end of chapter 5, Eothen, and I will be right back after this break. And welcome back. Sorry for that hiccup. Um, okay, and we continue on to today's reads with the Book of Brave Deeds. This story is going to be, let's see, where's our bookmark? This is quite, yeah, here it is. Okay. The Keys of Caliaus, from a Book of Golden Deeds, by C.M. Young. Edward wins our cities, but Philippa conquers hearts. Nowhere does the continent of Europe approach Great Britain so closely as at the Straits of Dover, and when her sovereigns were full of the vain hope of obtaining the crown of France, or at least of regaining the great possessions that their forefathers had owned as French nobles, there was no spot so coveted by them as the fortress of Calais, the possession of which gave an entrance into France. Thus it was that when, in 1346, Edward III had beaten Philip VI at the Battle of Crécy, the first use he made of his victory was to march upon Calais and lay siege to it. The walls were exceedingly strong and solid, mighty defenses of masonry, of huge thickness, and like rocks for solidity, guarded it. And the king knew that it would be useless to attempt a direct assault. Indeed, during all the Middle Ages, the modes of protecting fortifications were far more efficient than the modes of attacking them. The walls could be made enormously massive, the towers raised to a great height, and the defenders so completely sheltered by battlements that they could not easily be injured, and could take aim from the top of their turrets or from their loophole windows. The gates had absolute little castles of their own. A moat flowed around the walls, full of water and only capable of being crossed by a drawbridge, behind which the portcullis, a grating, armed beneath with spikes, was always ready to drop from the archway of the gate and close up the entrance. The only chance of taking a fortress by direct attack was to fill up the moat with earth and faggots, and then raise ladders against the walls, or else to drive engines against the defense's battering rams, which struck them with heavy beams. Mangonels, which launched stones, sows, whose arched wooden backs protected troops of workmen who tried to undermine the wall, and moving towers consisting of a succession of stages or shelves filled with soldiers, and with a bridge with iron hooks capable of being launched from the highest story to the top of the battlements. The besieged could generally disconcert the battering ram by hanging beds or mattresses over the walls to receive the brunt of the blow. The sows could be crushed with the heavy stones, the towers burnt by well-directed flaming missiles, the ladders overthrown, and in general the besiegers suffered a great deal more damage than they could inflict. Cannon had indeed just been brought into use at the Battle of Casas, but they only consisted of iron bars fastened together with hoops, and were as yet of little use, and thus there seemed to be little danger to a well-guarded city from any enemy outside the walls. King Edward arrived before the place with all his victorious army early in August. His good knights and squires, arrayed in glittering steel armor, covered with surcoats richly embroidered with their heraldic bearings. His stout men-at-arms, each of whom was attended by 3 bold followers, and his archers with their crossbows to shoot bolts, and longbows to shoot arrows of a yard long, so that it used to be said that each went into battle with 3 men's lives under his girdle, namely, the 3 arrows he kept there ready to his hand. With the king was his son Edward, Prince of Wales, who had just won the golden spurs of knighthood so gallantly at Crusade, when only in his 17th year, and likewise the famous Hainault knight, Sir Walter Malony, and all that was the noblest and bravest in England. This whole glittering army at their head, the king's great royal standard, bearing the golden lilies of France, quartered with the lions of England, and each troop guided by the square banner, swallow-tailed pennon, or pointed pennoncelle of their leader, came marching to the gates of Calais, above which floated the blue standard of France, with its golden flowers, and with it the banner of the governor, Sir Jean de Vigny. A herald, in a rich long robe embroidered with the arms of England, rode up to the gate, a trumpet sounding before him, and called upon Sir Jean Vigny to give up the place to Edward, King of England and of France, as he claimed to be. Sir Jean make answer that he held the town for Philippe, King of France, and that he would defend it to the last. The herald rode back again, and the English began the siege of the city. At first they only encamped, and the people of Calais must have seen the whole plain covered with the white canvas tents marshalled round the ensigns of the leaders, and here and there a more gorgeous one displaying the colors of the owner. Still there was no attack upon the walls. The warriors were to be seen walking about in the leathern suits they wore under their armor, or if a party was to be seen with their coats of mail on, helmet on head, and lance in hand, it was not against Calais that they came. They rode out into the country, and by might be seen driving back before them herds of cattle and flocks of sheep or pigs that they had seized and taken away from the poor peasants. And at night the sky would show red lights where farms and homesteads had been set on fire. After a time, in front of the tents, the English were to be seen hard at work with beams and boards, setting up huts for themselves, and thatching them over with straw or broom. These wooden houses were all ranged in regular streets, and there was a marketplace in the midst, whither every Saturday came farmers and butchers to sell corn and meat, and hay for the horses, and the English merchants and the Flemish weavers would come by sea and by land to bring cloth, bread, weapons, and everything that could be needed to be sold in this warlike market. The governor, Sir Jean de Vigny, began to perceive that the king did not mean to waste his men by making vain attacks on the strong walls of Calais, but to shut up the entrance by land and watch the coast by sea, so as to prevent any provisions from being taken in, and so to starve him into surrendering. Sir Jean de Vigny however, hoped that before he should be entirely reduced by famine, the King of France would be able to get together another army and come to his relief. And at any rate, he was determined to do his duty and hold out for his master to the last. But as food was already beginning to grow scarce, he was obliged to turn out such persons as he could not fight, and had no stores of their own. And so one Wednesday morning he caused all the poor to be brought together, men, women, and children, and sent them all out of the town, to the number of 1700. It was probably the truest mercy, for he had no food to give them, and they could only have starved miserably within town, or have hindered him from savaging it for his sovereign. But to them it was dreadful to be driven out of house and home, straight down upon the enemy. And they went along weeping and wailing, till the English soldiers met them, and asked why they had come out. They answered that they had been put out because they had nothing to eat, and their sorrowful, famished looks gained pity for them. King Edward sent orders that not only should they go safely through his camp, but that they should all rest and have the first hearty dinner that they had eaten for many a day. And he sent every one a small sum of money before they left the camp, so that many of them went on their way praying aloud for the enemy who had been so kind to them. A great deal happened whilst King Edward kept watch in his wooden town, and the citizens of Calais guarded their walls. England was invaded by King David II of Scotland, with a great army, and the good Queen Philippa, who was left to govern at home in the name of her little son Lionel, assembled all the forces that were left at home and sent them to meet him. And one autumn day a ship crossed the Straits of Dover, and a messenger brought King Edward letters from his queen to say that the Scots army had been entirely defeated at Neville's Cross, near Durham, and that their king was a prisoner, but that he had been taken by a squire named John Copeland, who would not give him up to her. King Edward sent letters to John Copeland to come to him at Calais, and when the squire had made his journey, the king took him by the hand, saying, "Ha! Welcome, my squire, who by his valor has captured our adversary, the King of Scotland." Copeland, falling to one knee, replied, "If God, out of his great kindness, has given me the King of Scotland, no one ought to be jealous of it, for God can, when he pleases, send his grace to a poor squire as well as to a great lord. Sir, do not take it amiss if I did not surrender him to the orders of my lady the queen, for I hold my lands of you, and my oath is to you, not to her." The king was not displeased with his squire's sturdiness, but made him a knight, gave him a pension of 500 pounds a year, and desired him to surrender his prisoner to the queen, as his own representative. This was accordingly done, and King David was lodged in the Tower of London. Soon after, 3 days before All Saints' Day, there was a large and gay fleet to be seen crossing from the white cliffs of Dover, and the king, his son, and his knights rode down to the landing place to welcome plump, fair-haired Queen Philippa, and all her train of ladies, who had come in great numbers to visit their husbands, fathers, or brothers in the wooden town. Then there was a great court, and numerous feasts and dances, and the knights and squires were constantly striving who could do the bravest deed of prowess to please the ladies. The King of France had placed numerous knights and men-at-arms in the neighboring towns and castles, and there were constant fights whenever the English went out foraging, and many bold deeds that were much admired were done. The great point was to keep provisions of the town, and there was much fighting between the French, who tried to bring in supplies, and the English, who intercepted them. Very little was brought in by land, and Sir John de Venet and his garrison would have been quite starved but for two sailors of Abbeville, named Morant and Mestria, who knew the coast thoroughly, and often in the dark autumn evenings would guide in a whole fleet of little boats, loaded with bread and meat for the starving men within the city. They were often chased by King Edward's vessels, and were sometimes very nearly taken, but they always managed to escape, and thus they were still enabled the garrison to hold out. So all the winter passed. Christmas was kept within brilliant feastings and high merriment by the king and his queen in their wooden palace outside, and with lean cheeks and scanty fare by the besieged within. Lent was strictly observed, perforce, by the besieged, and Easter brought a betrothal in the English camp, a very unwilling one on the part of the bridegroom, the young Count of Flanders, who loved the French much better than the English, and had only been tormented into giving his consent by his unruly vassals, because they depended on the wool of the English sheep for their cloth works. So, through King Edward's daughter Isabel, was a beautiful fair-haired girl of 15. The young count would scarcely look at her, and in the last week before the marriage day, while her robes and her jewels were being prepared, and her father and mother were arranging the presents they should make to all of their court on the wedding day, the bridegroom went out hawking, gave his attendants the slip, and galloped off to Paris, where he was welcomed by King Philippe. This made Edward very wrathful, and more than ever determined to take Calais. About Whitsuntide, he completed a great wooden castle upon the seashore, and placed it in it numerous castles upon forgive me. About Whitsuntide, he completed a great wooden castle upon the seashore, and placed it in numerous warlike engines, with 40 men-at-arms and 200 archers, who kept such a watch upon the harbour that not even the two Abbeville sailors could enter it without having their boats crushed and sunk by the great stones that the mangonels launched upon them. The townspeople began to feel what hunger really was, but their spirits were kept up by the hope that the king was at last collecting an army for their rescue, and Philippe did collect all his forces and a great and noble army, and came one night to the hill of Sandgate, just behind the English army, the knights' armor glancing at their pennons, flying in the moonlight so as to be a beautiful sight to the hungry garrison, who could see the white tents pitched upon the hillside. Still, there were but two roads by which the French could reach their friends in the town, one along the sea-coast, the other by a marshy road higher up the country. And there was but one bridge by which the river could be crossed. The English king's fleet could prevent any troops from passing along the coast road. The Earl of Derby guarded the bridge, and there was a great tower, strongly fortified close upon Caliaus. There were a few skirmishes, but the French king, finding it difficult to force his way to relieve the town, sent a party of knights with a challenge to King Edward to come out of his camp and do battle upon a fair field. To this Edward made answer, and that he had been nearly a year before Calais, and had spent large sums of money on the siege, and that he had nearly become master of the place, so that he had no intention of coming out only to gratify his adversary, who must try some other road if he could not make his way in by that before him. 3 days were spent in parleys, and then, without the slightest effort to rescue the brave, patient men within the town, away went King Philippe of France with all his men, and the garrison saw the host that had crowded the hill of Sandgate melt away like a summer cloud. August had come again, and they had suffered privation for a whole year for the sake of the king, who deserted them at their utmost need. They were in so grievous a state of hunger and distress that the hardiest could endure no more. For since Whitsuntide, no fresh provisions had reached them. The governor, therefore, went to the battlements and made signs that he wished to hold a parley, and the king appointed Lord Basset and Sir Walter Mauny to meet him and appoint the terms of surrender. The governor owned that the garrison was reduced and to the greatest extremity of distress, and requested that the king would be contented with obtaining the city and fortress, leaving the soldiers and inhabitants to depart in peace. But Sir Walter Mauny was forced to make an answer that the king, his lord, was so much enraged that the delay and expense that Calais had cost him, that he would only consent to receive the whole on unconditional terms, leaving him free to slay or to ransom or to make prisoners whomever he pleased. And he was known to consider that there was a heavy reckoning to pay both for the trouble the siege had cost him and the damage the Calians had previously done to his ships. The brave answer was, "These conditions are too hard for us. We are but a small number of knights and squires who have loyally served our lord and master as you would have done, and have suffered much ill and disquiet, but we will endure far more than any man has done in such a post, before we consent that the smallest boy in the town shall fare worse than ourselves. I therefore entreat you, for pity's sake, to return to the king, and beg him to have compassion, for I have such an opinion of his gallantry that I think he will alter his mind." The king's mind seemed, however, sternly made up, and all that Sir Walter Mauny and the barons of the council could obtain from him was that he would pardon the garrison and townsmen on condition that 6 of the chief citizens should present themselves to him, coming forth with bare feet and heads, with halters round their necks, carrying the keys of the town, and becoming absolutely his own to punish for their obstinacy, as he should think fit. On hearing this reply, Sir Jean de Venay begged Sir Walter Mauny to wait till he could consult the citizens, and repairing to the marketplace, he caused a great bell to be rung, at sound of which all the inhabitants came together in the town hall. When he told them of these hard terms, he could not refrain from weeping bitterly, and wailing and lamentation arose all around him. Should all starve together, or sacrifice their best and most honored after all suffering in common so long? Then a voice was heard. It was that of the richest burgher in the town, Eustace de Saint Pierre. "Messieurs, high and low," he said, "it would be a sad pity to suffer so many people to die through hunger. If it could be prevented, and to hinder it would be meritorious in the eyes of our Saviour, I have such faith and trust in finding grace before God, if I die to save my townsmen, that I name myself as first of the 6. As the burgher ceased, his fellow townsmen wept aloud, and many, amid tears and groans, threw themselves at his feet in a transport of grief and gratitude. Another citizen, very rich and respected, rose up and said, "I will be second to my comrade Eustace." His name was Jean Dier. After him, Jacques Wissant, another very rich man, offered himself as companion to these, who were both his cousins, and his brother Pierre would not be left behind, and two more unnamed made up this gallant band of men willing to offer their lives for the rescue of their fellow townsmen. Sir Jean de Vigny mounted a little horse, for he had been wounded and was still lame, and came to the gate with them, followed by all the people of the town, weeping and wailing, yet for their own sakes and their children's, not daring to prevent the sacrifice. And the gates were open. The governor and the 6 passed out, and the gates were again shut behind them. Sir Jean then rode up to Sir Walter Mauny, and told him how these burghers had voluntarily offered themselves, begging him to do all in his power to save them, and Sir Walter promised with his whole heart to plead their cause. De Vigny went back into the town full of heaviness and anxiety, and the 6 citizens were led by Sir Walter to the presence of the king, in his full court. They all knelt down, and the foremost said, "Most gallant king, you see before you 6 burghers of Calais, who have all been capital merchants, and who bring you the keys of the castle and town. We yield ourselves to your absolute will and pleasure in order to save the remainder of the inhabitants of Calais, who have suffered much distress and misery. Condescend, therefore, out of your nobleness of mind, to have pity on us." Strong emotion was excited from all of the barons and knights who stood round as they saw the resigned countenances, pale and thin with the patiently endured hunger of these venerable men, offering themselves in the cause of their fellow townsmen. Many tears of pity were shed, but the king still showed himself implacable, and commanded that they should be led away, and their heads stricken off. Sir Walter Mauny interceded for them with all his might. And there is an illustration of Queen Philippa threw herself upon his knees. Even telling the king that with such an execution would tarnish his honor, and that the reprisals would be made on his own garrisons, and all the nobles joined in entreating pardon for the citizens, but still without effect, and the headsmen had been actually sent for, when Queen Philippa, her eyes amongst the captives, and said, "Ah, gentle sir, since I have crossed the sea with much danger to see you, I have never asked you one favor. Now I beg as a boon to myself, for the sake of the Son of the Blessed Mary, and for your love to me, that you will be merciful to these men." For some time the king looked at her in silence, and then he exclaimed, "Dame, dame, would that you had been anywhere than here. You have entreated in such a manner that I cannot refuse you. I therefore give these men to you, to do as you please with." Joyfully did Queen Philippa conduct the 6 citizens to her own apartments, where she made them welcome, sent them new garments, entertained them with plentiful dinner, and dismissed them each with a gift of 6 nobles. After this, Sir Walter Mauny entered the city and took possession of it, retaining Sir Jean de Vigny and other knights and squires till they should ransom themselves, and sending out the old French inhabitants, for the king was resolved to people the city entirely with English, in order to gain a thoroughly strong hold of this first step in France. The king and queen took up their abode in the city, and the houses of Jean d'Air were, it appears, granted to the queen, perhaps because she considered the man himself as her charge, and wished to secure them for him, and her little daughter Margaret was shortly after born in one of his houses. Eustace de Saint Pierre was taken into high favor, and he was placed in charge of the new citizens whom the king placed in the city. Indeed, as this story is told by no chronicler but a Froissart, some have doubted of it, and thought the violent resentment thus imputed to Edward III inconsistent with his general character. But it is evident that the men of Calais had given him strong provocation by attacks on his shipping, piracies which were not easily forgiven, and that he considered that he had a right to make an example of them. It is not unlikely that he might, after all, have intended to forgive them, and have given the Queen the grace of obtaining their pardon, so as to excuse himself from the fulfillment of some over-hasty threat. But, however, this may have been nothing can lessen the glory of the 6 grave and patient men who went forth by their own free will to meet what might be a cruel and disgraceful death, in order to obtain the safety of their fellow townsmen. And that was the keys of Caliaus. So, I hope you have enjoyed this section, and I will be right back after this short break. Okay, and we shall be continuing with The Outline of History, H.G. Wells. And we will be continuing with the Records of Rocks, Section 2. In the previous section, we have had no clear definition of life. It may be well to put plainly certain general facts about this new thing which was creeping in the shallow waters and intertidal muds of the early Paleozoic period, and which is perhaps confined to our planet alone in all the immensity of space. Life differs from all things, whatever that are without life, in certain general aspects. There are the most wonderful differences among living things today. But all living things, past and present, agree in possessing a certain power of growth. All living things take nourishment. All living things move about as they feed and grow. Through the movement may be no more than the spread of roots through the soil, or of branches in the air. Moreover, living things reproduce. They give rise to other similar living things, either by growing, then dividing, or by means of seeds or spores or eggs, or other ways of producing young. Reproduction is a characteristic of life. No living thing goes on living forever. There seems to be a limit of growth for every kind of living thing. Among very small and simple living things, such as that microscopic blob of living matter, the amoeba, an individual may grow and then divide completely into two new individuals, which again may divide in their turn. Many other microscopic creatures live actively for a time, grow, and then become quiet and inactive, enclose themselves in an outer covering, and break up wholly into a number of still smaller things, spores, which are released and scattered, and again grow into the likeness of their parent. Among more complex creatures, the reproduction is not usually such simple division, though division does occur even in the case of many creatures big enough to be visible to the unassisted eye. But the rule with almost all larger beings is that the individual grows up to a certain limit of size. Then, before it becomes unwieldy, its growth declines and stops. As it reaches its full size, it matures. It begins to reproduce young, which are either born alive or hatched from eggs. But all of its body not produce young. Only a special part does that. After the individual has lived and produced offspring for some time, it ages and dies. It does so by a sort of necessity. There is a practical limit to its life as well as to its growth. These things are as true of plants as they are of animals, and they are not true of things that do not live. Non-living things, such as crystals, grow, but they have no set limits of growth or size. They do not move of their own accord, and there is no stir within them. Crystals, once formed, may last unchanged for millions of years. There is no reproduction for any non-living thing. This growth and dying of and reproduction of living things leads to some very wonderful consequences. The young, which a living thing produces, are either directly or after some intermediate stages and changes, such as the change of a caterpillar into a butterfly, like the parent living thing, but they are never exactly like it or like each other. There is always a slight difference, which we speak of as individuality. 1,000 butterflies this year may produce very many more next year. These latter will look to us almost exactly like their predecessors, but each one will have just that slight difference. It is hard for us to see individuality in butterflies because we do not observe them very closely, but it is easy for us to see it in men. All the men and women in the world are now are descended from the men and women of AD 1800. But not one of us now is exactly the same as one of that vanished generation. And what is true of men and butterflies is true of every sort of living thing, of plants, of animals. Every species changes all its individualities in each generation. That is as true of all the minute creatures that swarmed and reproduced and died in the Archaeozoic and Proterozoic seas as it is of men today. Every species of living things is continually dying and being born again as a multitude of fresh individuals. Consider that what must happen to a newborn generation of living things of any species. Some of the individuals will be stronger or sturdier or better suited to succeed in life in some way than the rest. Many individuals will be weaker or less suited. In particular, single cases, any sort of luck or accident may occur. But on the whole, be better equipped individuals will live and grow up and reproduce themselves, and the weaker will, as the rule, go under. The latter will be less able to get food, to fight their enemies, and pull through. So that in each generation there is, as it were, a picking over of the species, a picking out of most of the weak or unsuitable, and a preference for the strong and suitable. This process is called natural selection, or the survival of the fittest, though survival of the fitter would be more precise expression. It follows, therefore, from the fact that living things grow and breed and die, that every species, so long as the conditions under which it lives remain the same, become more and more perfectly fitted to those conditions in every generation. But conditions do not remain the same, and every species lives a little uneasily in its condition. Adaptation is always imperfect, and sometimes it is very imperfect, and coming to the help of life in fitting itself to the exigencies of circumstance is the fact that ever and again appear novelties in structure, sudden marked differences called mutations, differences much greater than the ordinary individual difference. These mutations may be encumbrances in the struggle for life, or helps, or they may not affect an animal's chances at all. In the former case, they are rejected by natural selection. In the second, they are welcomed and encouraged. In the third, they may spread throughout a species, unchallenged, features neither helpful nor harmful, a spontaneous change. We do not as yet know what causes mutations. We know only that the life is continually experimenting in this way, and that its experiments come to the sieve of natural selection for endorsement, indifference, or elimination. Mutation itself seems to be an entirely haphazard process. A mutation may just hit the urgent need of the time. It may be a pointless irrelevance, or it may be an absurd variation. In the latter case, it produces a monster, which dies. In the former, it spreads throughout the species. The manner of its spreading, elucidated by the Abbe Mendel, is too long a story to relate here. The reader will find it clearly explained in the Science of Life, now a companion work to this outline. In the Science of Life, he will find also a long and exhaustive account of contemporary evolutionary discussion and a far ampler history of the forms of life before man. Let us, to take a simple instance, here consider the case of some little furry, whitey brown animal living in a bitterly cold land, which is usually under snow. Such individuals have the thickest, whitest fur, will be the least hurt by the cold. less seen by their enemies and less conspicuous as they seek their prey. Every mutation in that direction will be advantageous. The fur of this species will thicken and its whiteness increase with every generation until there is no advantages in carrying any more fur. Imagine how a change of climate that brings warmth into the land sweeps away the snows, makes white creatures glaringly visible during the greater part of the year, and thick fur an encumbrance. Then every individual with a touch of brown in its coloring and a thinner fur will find itself at an advantage, and very white and heavy fur will be a handicap. Every favorable mutation will be seized upon and welcomed by natural selection during the ages of stress. There will be a weeding out of the white in favor of the brown in each generation. If this change of climate comes about too quickly and no favorable mutations chance along, the species may be exterminated. But if the mutations appear of a helpful kind and have time to spread themselves widely, the species, that although it may have a hard time, may yet be able to change itself and adapt itself generation by generation. This change and adaptation is called the modification of species. Perhaps this change of climate does not occur all over the lands inhabited by the species. Maybe it occurs only on one side of some great arm of the sea, or some great mountain range, or such like divide, and not on the other. A warm ocean current, like the Gulf Stream, may be deflected and flow so as to warm one side of the barrier, leaving the other side still cold. Then on the cold side, this species will still be going on to its utmost possible furriness and whiteness, and on the other side it will be modifying towards brownness and thinner coat. At the same time, there will probably be other changes going on. A difference in the paws, perhaps, may be encouraged here and discouraged there, because one half of the species will be frequently scratching through the snow for its food, while the other will be scampering over brown earth. Probably also the difference of climate will mean differences in the sort of food available, and that may favor differences in the teeth and the digestive organs. And there may be changes in the sweat and oil glands of the skin due to the changes in the fur, and these will affect the excretory organs and all the internal chemistry of the body. And so, through all the structure of the creature, a time may come when the two separated varieties of this formerly single species may become so unlike each other through the acclimation of individual and mutational differences as to be recognizably different species. Such a splitting up of a species in the course of generations into two or more species is called the differentiation of species. And it should be clear to the reader that given these elemental facts of life, given growth and death and reproduction with individual variation and mutation in a world that changes, life must change in this way. Modification and differentiation must occur. Old species must disappear and new ones appear. We have chosen for our instance here a familiar sort of animal. But what is true of furry beasts in snow and ice is true of all life, and equally true of the sort soft jellies and simple beginnings that flowed and crawled for hundreds of millions of years between the tidal levels and in the shallow, warm waters of the Proterozoic seas. They were all varying and mutating and living in a world of change that encouraged many of their variations and mutations. The early life of the early world, when the blazing sun rose and the set in only a quarter of the time it now takes. When the warm seas poured in great tides over the sandy and muddy shores of the rocky lands, and the air was full of clouds and steam, must have been modified and varied, and species must have developed at a great pace. Life was probably as swift and short as the days and years, and the generations which natural selection picked over followed one another in rapid succession. Natural selection is a slower process with man than any other creature. It takes 20 years or more before an ordinary Western European grows up and reproduces. In the case of most animals, the new generation is on trial in a year or less. With such simple and lowly beings, however, as first appeared in the primordial seas, growth and reproduction was probably a matter of a few brief hours, or even of a few brief minutes. Modification and differentiation of species must accordingly have been extremely rapid, and life had already developed in a great variety of widely contrasted forms before it began to leave traces in the rocks. The record of the rocks does not begin, therefore, with any group of the closely related forms from which all subsequent and existing creatures are descended. It begins in the sea, with nearly every main division of the animal kingdom already represented. Plants are already plants, and animals animals. The brachiopods are already in their shells, consuming much of the same sort of food that oysters and mussels do now. The great water scorpions crawl among the seaweeds. The trilobites roll up into balls and unroll and scuttle away. In that ancient mud, there was probably as rich a life of infusoria and the like as one finds in a drop of ditch water today. In the ocean, there was an abundance of minute and translucent, often phosphorescent beings, but the land above the high tide line was still, so far as we can guess, a stony wilderness without a trace of life. And that's the end of that section. And I shall be right back with American literature after this break. And welcome back. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Um, if you recall in episode 22, we learned about Bartolome de la Casas, and I will be reading two of his letters from the Norton Anthology, American Literature, 4th edition, Volume 1. Alright, so from the very brief relations of the devastation of the Indies from Hispaniola. This was the first land in the New World to be destroyed and depopulated by the Christians, and here they began their subjugation of the women and children, taking them away from the Indians to use them and ill use them. Eating the food that they provided with their sweat and toil, the Spaniards did not content themselves with what the Indians gave them of their own free will, according to their ability, which was always too little to satisfy enormous appetites. For a Christian eats and consumes in one day an amount of food that would suffice to feed 3 houses inhabited by 10 Indians for 1 month, and they committed other acts of force and violence and oppression, which made the Indians realize that these men had not come from heaven. And some of the Indians concealed their foods, while others concealed their wives. Some of the Indians and children, and still others fled to the mountains to avoid the terrible transactions of the Christians, and the Christians attacked them with buffets, and beatings, until finally they laid hands on the nobles of villages. Then they behaved with such temerity and shamelessness that the most powerful ruler of the islands had to see his own wife raped by a Christian officer. From that time onward, the Indians began to seek ways to throw the Christians out of their lands. They took up arms, but their weapons were very weak and of little service in offense, and still less in defense. Because of this, the wars of the Indians against each other are little more than the games played by children. And the Christians, with their horses and swords and pikes, began to carry out massacres and strange cruelties against them. They attacked the towns and spared neither the children, nor the aged, nor pregnant women, nor women in childbed, not only stabbing them and dismembering them, but cutting them to pieces as if dealing with sheep in the slaughterhouse. They laid bets as to who, with one stroke of the sword, could split a man in two, or could cut off their head or spill out his entrails with a single stroke of the pike. They took infants from their mothers' breasts, snatching them by the legs, pitching them headfirst against the crags, or snatched them by the arms and threw them into the rivers, roaring with laughter and saying, as the babies fell into the water, "Boil there, you offspring of the devil." Other infants they put to the sword along with their mothers and anyone else who happened to be nearby. They made some low wide gallows on which the hanged victims' feet almost touched the ground, stringing up their victims in lots of 13, in memory of our Redeemer and his 12 apostles. Then set burning wood at their feet, and thus burned them alive. To others they were attached straw, or wrapped their whole bodies in straw and set them afire. With still others, all those they wanted to capture alive, they cut off their hands and hung them round their victims' necks, saying, "Go now, carry the message," meaning take the news to the Indians who have fled to the mountains. They usually dealt with the chieftains and nobles in the following way. They made a grid of rods which they placed on forked sticks, then lashed the victims to the grid, and lighted a smoldering fire underneath, so that little by little, as those captives screamed in despair and torment, their souls would leave them. I once saw this when there were 4 or 5 nobles lashed on grids and burning. I seem even to recall that there were 2 or 3 pairs of grids where others were burning, and because they uttered such loud screams, and they disturbed the captain's sleep, he ordered them to be strangled. And the constable, who was worse than the executioner, did not want to obey that order, and I know the name of the constable, and know his relatives in Seville, but instead put a stick over the victims' tongues, so that they could not make a sound, and he stirred up the fire, but not too much, so that they roasted slowly, as he liked. I saw all these things, and I have described, and countless others, and because all the people who could do so fled to the mountains to escape these inhuman, ruthless, and ferocious acts, the Spanish captains, enemies of the human race, pursued them with the fierce dogs they kept, which attacked the Indians, tearing them to pieces and devouring them. And because on few and far between occasions the Indians justifiably killed some Christians, the Spaniards made a rule among themselves that for every Christian slain by the Indians, they would slay 100 Indians. From the coast of Pearls, Paria, and the island of Trinidad, the Spaniards have brought to the island of Hispaniola, the island of San Juan, Puerto Rico, more than 2,000,000 souls taken captive, and have sent them to do hard labor in the mines, labors that cause many of them to die. And it is great sorrow and heartbreak to see this coastal land, which was so flourishing, now a depopulated desert. This is truth that can be verified, for no more do they bring ships loaded with Indians that have been thus attacked and captured, as I have related. No more do they cast overboard into the sea the third part of the numerous Indians they stow on their vessels, these dead beings added to those they have killed in their native lands. The captives crowded into the holds of their ships without food or water, or with very little, so as not to deprive the Spanish tyrants who call themselves ship owners, and who carry enough food for themselves on their voyages of attack. And for the pitiful Indians who died of hunger and thirst, there is no remedy but to cast them into the sea. And verily, as a Spaniard told me, their ships in these regions could voyage without compass or chart, merely by following for the distance between the Caliaus Islands, the Bahamas, and Hispaniola, which is 60 or 70 leagues, the trace of those Indian corpses floating in the sea. Corpses that had been cast overboard by earlier ships. Afterward, when they disembark on the island of Hispaniola, it is heartbreaking to see those naked Indians, heartbreaking for anyone with a visage of piety, the famished state they are in, fainting and falling down, weak from hunger, men, women, old people, and children. Then, like sheep, they are sorted out into flocks of 10 or 20 persons, separating fathers from sons, wives from husbands, and the Spaniards draw lots, the ship owners carrying off their share, the best flock, to compensate them for the moneys that they have invested in their fleet of 2 or 3 ships, the ruffian tyrants getting their share of captives who will be house slaves. And when in this repartimento, which means distribution, attempts were made by a royal decree in 1503 to require that the masters of the American Indians convert them to Christianity and serve as trustees for their property. But the repartimento ceased to be anything more than a slaveholding system. a tyrant gets an old person or an invalid, he says, "Why do you give me this one? To bury him? And the sick one, do you give him to me to make him well?" See by such remarks in what esteem the Spaniards hold the Indians, and judge if they are accomplishing the divine concepts of love for our fellow man, as laid down by the prophets. The tyranny exercised by the Spaniards against the Indians in the work of pearl fishing is one of the most cruel that can be imagined. There is no life as infernal and desperate in this century that can be compared with it. Although the mining of gold is a dangerous and burdensome way of life, the pearl fishers dive into the sea at a depth of 5 fathoms, and do this from sunrise to sunset, and remain for many minutes without breathing, tearing the oysters out of their rocky beds where the pearls are formed. They come to the surface with a netted bag of these oysters, where a Spanish torturer is waiting in a canoe or skiff. And if the pearl diver shows signs of wanting to rest, he is showered with blows. His hair is pulled, and he is thrown back into the water, obliged to continue the hard work of tearing out the oysters and bringing them again to the surface. The food is given the pearl divers is codfish, not very nourishing, and the bread made of maize, the bread of the Indies. At night, the pearl divers are chained so they cannot escape. Often a pearl diver does not return to the surface, for these waters are infested with man-eating sharks of 2 kinds, both vicious marine animals that can kill, eat, and swallow a whole man. In this harvesting of pearls, let us again consider whether Spaniards preserve the divine concepts of love for their fellow men when they place the bodies of the Indians in such mortal danger, and their souls too, for these pearl divers perish without the holy sacraments, and it is solely because of the Spaniards' greed. Spaniards' greed for gold, that they force the Indians to lead such a life, often a brief life, for it is impossible to continue for long diving into cold water and holding the breath for minutes at a time, repeating this hour after hour, day after day. The continual cold penetrates them, constricts the chest, and they die spitting blood or weakened by diarrhea. The hair of these pearl divers, naturally black, as if burnished by the saltpeter in the water, and hangs down their backs, making them look like sea dogs or monsters of another species. And in this extraordinary labor, or better put, in this infernal labor, the Lucian Indians are finally consumed, as are captive Indians from other provinces, and all of them were publicly sold for 150 castellanos. These Indians who had lived happily on their islands until the Spaniards came, although such a thing was against the law, but the unjust judges did nothing to stop it. For all the Indians of these islands are known to be great swimmers. How sad. So, even though that we're going out on such a low tone, I really hope that you enjoyed this reading of Tuesday Reads. And I hope that you will join me again in either Thoughts on News, Wicked Shizuku's reviews, and the book reviews that I do, and more to come. And with that, I bid you good night.